A year of war has left Gaza unrecognizable. Relentless Israeli bombardment has obliterated the infrastructure needed to provide even the basic necessities of life. Bedad Maichi takes a look at the trail of destruction the Israeli military has caused in Gaza.
More than 85,000 tons of explosives, destroying more than 75% of buildings across the Gaza Strip. Israel's attacks have not spared any of the 36 hospitals across the Strip, despite their protection under international humanitarian law. 84% of health facilities have been damaged or destroyed, according to a UN report. School buildings have not been spared, with around 93% either destroyed or damaged. That translates to most of Gaza's 560 educational facilities struck in Israeli attacks. More than 600 mosques have been fully or partially destroyed. All 3 churches in Gaza have been damaged as well. Some of these religious sites are historical, dating back centuries. Access to clean water and sanitation have been crippled, with 67% of that infrastructure destroyed, leaving Gaza vulnerable to disease outbreaks. In Gaza City, all desalination plants have been damaged. Entire cities across the Strip have been leveled. This is Beit Hanun in the north, with nearly all of its residents forced out and its structures flattened. And entire residential blocks as well. This is in Beit Lahia, where many farmers live. Residential towers and crops completely destroyed. Bombs and bulldozers have turned 68% of roads into gravel and rubble, according to satellite assessments. That's made aid deliveries near impossible, and has turned Gaza unrecognizable to its people.
Well, earlier, my colleague Elizabeth Pranam spoke to Raz Segal. He's Director of Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University. He says genocidal intent amongst Israel's leaders was clear from the very start of the war.
It was very clear in those first few days. We heard clear, unashamed and direct expressions of what's called in the UN Genocide Convention from 1948, intent to destroy Israelis with command authority in international law, that is state leaders and senior army officers and war cabinet ministers were talking about flattening Gaza, erasing Gaza. We heard explicit dehumanization of Palestinians by these people with command authority. Of course, the Israeli media and public spaces were filled with genocidal rhetoric. But if we're talking about the intent in international law, then we heard explicit dehumanization of Palestinians. Of course, Israel's War Minister Yoav Gallant's declaration of a total siege on 9th of October that targets indeed the entire population, and the next day calling Palestinians then human animals, and the next day Israeli president saying explicitly that the entire population of 2.3 million Palestinians, half of which are under the age of 18, they're all responsible for the Hamas that attacked on October 7th. So the expressions of intent to destroy, and intent is a very central element of the crime of genocide in international law, were clear in front of our eyes. And since then, they continued. For dozens and dozens of time, the organization Law for Palestine has documented actually hundreds of expressions of intent to destroy in Israeli politics, media, society. But if we talk about, again, the people with command authority, we have these documented intents to destroy dozens of times since then until today.
And those words have been met with unprecedented destruction. Over the past year, we have seen the brutal killing of innocent men, women and children in Gaza every day. What does this mean for the organizations such as the UN, the International Criminal Court, that are supposed to apply international law to protect civilians, to prevent genocide?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Israel, as you said, has done what it told us that it will do. And in the language of the UN Genocide Convention, it has created conditions calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part, and through killings, through destruction of everything, as we've just heard in the Gaza Strip, and through the starvation policies that we know that even if the Israeli attack stops today, right now, Palestinians in Gaza will continue to die in large numbers in the tens and perhaps hundreds of thousands in the coming months. So this, I mean, as I've said before, if this is not genocide, I don't know what genocide is.
The fact that it's been allowed to happen for 1 year, what does that mean for international law, for a rules-based order?
I think that it's very clear to everyone that the rules-based order, the international legal system, is on the verge of collapse. Now, because it's one of its characteristics of impunity, and specifically impunity for Israel, which was actually foundational in the international legal order. I mean, we have to understand that when it emerged after World War II with genocide as its key innovation, the idea was that the Holocaust, what we now call the Holocaust, is unique in relation to genocide, and therefore Israel, the state where Holocaust survivors, many of them tried to build their lives, is also unique. And this means that the crime of genocide emerged, providing actually Israel impunity in the international legal system. It became unimaginable to think that Israel would perpetrate any crime under international law, not to mention genocide, and therefore impunity became structural, right, in the international legal system. Now, this is why we've seen decades of Israel violations of international law, right, with impunity. And as you've said, we've seen now a year of this ongoing horrific genocidal assault, and now also Israel's attack on Lebanon. I do think, though, that we are also, and this is a longer term issue. I mean, Israel has achieved its goal of destroying Gaza, and this is horrific, and this is a reality that we're all witnessing. But I think that we are also living through a time of change, because the idea of Israel impunity in international law, that's breaking down. It's breaking down in the charge of genocide that South Africa brought in the International Court of Justice against Israel, with 3 provisional measure rulings, right, that have found and confirmed that it's plausible that Israel is perpetrating genocide in Gaza, which is really unprecedented. Now, there's a lot of shortcomings in the International Court of Justice provisional measure rulings, without a doubt, right? But this, we can't undermine the significance of this issue that cracks, that the impunity for Israel in the system is starting to crack. And in the International Criminal Court, we've seen Karim Khan, who's a very conservative international legal figure, right, apply for arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and War Minister Yoav Gallant and Hamas leaders. But when he talked about this application, he actually emphasized, and he's done this again since then, the issue of impunity. And he said very directly that if we don't now show, that his words, that international law applies equally, then the whole system might come down. So what I'm saying is that I think we're in the process of change, right, that is very significant, and there is a possibility for the system changing, right? In the short term, prevention of genocide in Gaza has failed miserably, completely.
Well, as we heard in Behrdad's report, the Israeli military has damaged or completely destroyed 93% of schools in Gaza, and all universities have been destroyed. One term commonly used in this war is Scholasticide. It refers to the systematic obliteration of education through the arrest, detention or killing of teachers, students and staff, as well as the destruction of educational infrastructure. Tarek Abu Azoum reports from Khan Yunis.
Despite the devastation, 10-year-old Tala Swedan makes her way through the ruins. With books in her bag and determination in her step, the walk to her makeshift classroom in Khan Yunis may be short, but when it comes to getting an education in Gaza, nothing is easy.
Before the war, we went to brick-and-mortar schools, not tents, sheds, or open spaces. We had normal classrooms, chairs and benches. Then the war started, and it reduced everything to ruins.
In the language class, students are alert and engaged. A setting that helps Tala recall happier days.
We had a better life, better living conditions, but now we're suspended between life and death. Any moment, a rocket could hit and blow us to pieces.
The United Nations says Israeli bombs have damaged or destroyed nearly all of Gaza's 560 schools. And the Education Ministry says more than 650,000 Palestinian students will be deprived from an education for a second year. Critics accuse Israel of deliberately targeting educational institutions. Isra Abu Mustafa set up this tent school on the ruins of a building in which she used to live and teach. Her students are given not only a chance to learn, but also some respite from the war.
We're trying to ease the mental suffering children are going through because of the war. They've witnessed death and destruction. Above all, many of these children are orphaned. Some lost their fathers, others lost their mothers. We're doing our best to provide what they've been deprived of. I consider them as my own children.
Isra wants to ensure everyone here gets the attention and care they deserve.
We're trying to meet all their needs, from regular education to mental health care, even emotional support. We'll provide them with personal support.
Assigning herself a task she knows will be difficult, but is determined to excel at.
With the schools in ruins, education will be affected for years, but Palestinian students say they are determined to go to schools despite the horrific humanitarian conditions and the Israeli bombing, because the longer children stay out of schools, the higher the risk of a lost generation. Tariq Abazoum, Al Jazeera, Khan Yunis, Palestine.
Well, one Palestinian teenager's dream of studying abroad was dashed when the war on Gaza began. 19-year-old Ahmed had been on track to study mechanical engineering in Algeria. Instead, he now spends his days living in a tent, searching for food and fetching water. This is his story.
أنا الطالب أحمد زياد أبو مراحيل نازح من شمال قطاع غزة وحاليا أنا متواجد في منطقة الزوايدة. أول ما إجتني يعني فرصة إنه يعني بدي أطلع على الجزائر كنت متحمس جدا وكنت يعني نفسي أنا أصلا أطلع من قبل الحرب. فعشان أشوف ناس ويعني وأتعلم وأدرس وغيره، وكان المفروض أمشي في الإجراءات وأتقدم. كنت حدرس هندسة ميكانيكا. هذا الإشي اللي أنا أصلا نفسي أدرسه طول حياتي، والحمد لله ما صارش نصيب. أنا بصحى الصبح، بصحى من أذان الفجر، أحط القرب على المية، بروح بعد ما أحط القرب بدك تروح تجري على التكية عشان تلحق لك صحن رز. بتطلع مع الشباب شوي تطير زهق في الحرب، بس على الفاضي زنانات وخوف ورعب. الحياة مش عارف، غزة لا تصلح للحياة، بطلت تصلح للحياة زي قبل. أهلي ما كانوش يعني كانوا مترددين يطلعوني، لأنه غزة قبل كانت حلوة وكانت جميل وكان الواحد قادر يتعلم في غزة. بس مع الحرب دمروا كل الجامعات، دمروا كل إشي ممكن الطلاب يستفيدوا منه، كل مصادر العلم ما ضلش إشي، كله على الأرض. حاليا أبوي الداعم الأول إلي وبقول لي دائما أول ما يفتح المعبر أنا بدي إياك تسافر، بديش أشوفك في البلد. رسالتي للعالم إنه اقفوا جنبنا، ادعمونا لو بأقل إشي، إحنا محتاجين لكل مساعدة منكم، وبتمنى يعني يخف الضغط علينا من ناحية اليهود ويقدروا يفتحوا المعابر عشان يطلعوا الطلاب وتقدر المساعدات تدخل من مثلا كتب، من دفاتر، أي إشي عشان يتعلموا الطلاب. وإن شاء الله يعني بدنا الحرب تقف وهيك وربنا يفرجها.
Farida Shahid is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Right to Education. She told Al Jazeera why education systems so often become a target in war.
I think one has to also understand why education is so often targeted in armed conflicts. Let me start with that. Education is not just about accumulating skills or information. It's a means of developing critical thinking and collective identities. It gives you a sense of who you are, both individually and collectively. And it provides a network of people. It makes sense of the world. Often you keep those companions from school for your life. And armed conflicts often, unfortunately, very commonly involve one, using educational institutions as bases and arms depots, but more importantly, in this case, a deliberate attack on the other's educational system. The destruction of textbooks and literary works are very common, including often in a different language from those who are doing the destroying. And this is really meant to disrupt and to rupture people's connections with their collective sense. And I think this is also a way of disrupting history. Otherwise, how do you explain the complete destruction of the 150-year-old archives in Gaza? And this is not just limited to Gaza, it happens elsewhere also. And most recently, I took up the issue, for instance, in the Russia-Ukraine war, unfortunately on both sides. But following conflict, you have history textbooks, in particular, are revised. And it's a way of valorizing one side and devaluing, sometimes even demonizing the other side. And I think Scholasticide has to be understood as a multi-generational war. In Gaza, it is meant to fundamentally dismantle the very foundation of Palestinian society, and they've literally reduced it to rubble, erasing history, as you mentioned already, all the churches. There's 195 cultural heritage sites, which were also destroyed. And UNICEF calls this a war on children. And I think, therefore, the very future. The psychological and physical damage is overwhelming. There's more than 1 million children who need mental and psychosocial support. And so I don't know where it was. At the end of the day, if we really want peace to end, peace to prosper and conflict to end, it means we need to be able to live together. We need to recognize the other person's humanity. And this is unfortunately something which is very easy to say and extremely difficult to achieve. But I think education does provide a pathway if it is done in the right way. And therefore, I'm really, really concerned.
Well, Israel's war on Gaza not only targeted educational institutions, but also humanitarian organizations. Its attacks have killed 226 United Nations aid workers. That's the most killed in any single conflict since the establishment of the UN. Gabriel Zondo has this report from the United Nations.
For decades, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian Refugees, known as UNRWA, has provided social services for more than 2 million people in Gaza. With a staff of around 13,000 in Gaza, mostly local Palestinians, they are doctors, nurses, teachers, humanitarians. But shortly after the October 7th attacks, Israel made it clear its war on Gaza would also be a war on UNRWA.
Israel cannot and will not allow UNRWA to continue in Gaza as it did in the past.
Israel launched a systematic disinformation campaign trying to discredit UNRWA and accused some of its staff members of participating in the October 7th attacks. A months-long UN internal investigation ultimately concluded that 9 staff members may have taken part. All of them were fired. Israel also accused UNRWA of systematic bias, but a UN-commissioned independent review mostly exonerated UNRWA from those charges. But the damage was done, both to Gaza and UNRWA. The United States and several other countries had already suspended funding to UNRWA.
UNRWA remains under attack. The baseless and shameless terrorism charge against a UN humanitarian agency are no longer a talking point, but a license to kill.
And that's exactly what happened. UNRWA staff have been killed by Israel in the past year. 140 UNRWA-run schools turned into shelters have also been attacked by Israel.
They are relentless.
UNRWA's Commissioner General says Israel's attacks on the organization have more sinister undercurrents.
They aim first at stripping Palestinians from the refugee status, but secondly also they aim at weakening or putting an end to the aspiration of the Palestinian for self-determination.
In recent months, as the genocide in Gaza continues, it has become clear the majority of the world rejects Israel's claims against UNRWA.
As the Secretary General
At a ministerial level meeting during the UN General Assembly last month in New York, countries rallied around the UN organization.
The indispensability of UNRWA cannot be questioned, nor can the fact that UNRWA cannot be replaced. For doing that is questioning the right of Palestinian children to food, to shelter, to education, and to hope.
Israel's campaign against UNRWA has largely failed. A year into the genocide, the agency remains. The UN says there are no plans to abandon Gaza. Gabriel Zondo, Al Jazeera, United Nations, New York.
Well, earlier my colleague Rob Matheson spoke to Filippo Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA. He describes Gaza as a graveyard for Palestinians.
UNRWA before the war was an agency which was investing in the human development of the Palestinian refugees. UNRWA was a real lifeline of the Palestinian refugees in Gaza. We had about 300,000 girls and boys in our school. We were providing education at the primary level and secondary level. We had vocational training. We were offering job opportunity to a number of Palestinians. Basically, the agency was a glimpse of hope for the Palestinian. Today, we are in a life-saving mode. We are trying to adapt to this catastrophe. We heard it before on how Gaza has been flattened down into rubble. It has been basically the war of all the extreme, the number of people who have been killed, injured. It has been a war on children. Gaza has become a graveyard, in fact, for the Palestinian in general. And we also heard that today people have nothing else than to daily struggle to stay alive, daily struggle against diseases, and daily struggle to find some food.
We were hearing in Gabriel Elizondo's report about the allegations that were made by Israel against some UNRWA staff and UNRWA itself. What kind of impact has that had on the organization's worldwide image?
It has a huge reputational impact, but fortunately the agency has taken bold measure from day one. An investigation has taken place, has concluded. We had also a review of all our internal management system, which concluded that we are more robust than any other agency in the region, and basically it shows that the agency is capable to deal with neutrality issues, and that in reality the attack on the agency are primarily politically motivated.
In terms of the money that UNRWA needs to raise in order to be able to operate, again, how much of these allegations had an impact on that? Is there a change in the willingness of countries around the world to supply money to UNRWA?
There is definitely a change. Donors need to be constantly reassured, and I think the seriousness of UNRWA to implement the recommendation of the review, the famous Catherine Colonna report of the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of France, the seriousness of implementing this measure has also helped donors to reinforce their confidence in the agency. Today, there is only one country which has suspended and frozen its contribution to the agency.
We mentioned before that 222 United Nations aid workers have been killed. And of course, UNRWA relies heavily on local staff with local knowledge and local contacts to be able to operate. How difficult is it now, given the circumstances that UNRWA has found itself, not just, of course, in Gaza, but also in the occupied West Bank, and now, of course, looking northwards to Lebanon as well? How difficult is it for UNRWA to recruit people with that very vital local knowledge?
The number of UNRWA staff killed is today at 226. There is no day without an increase of staff being killed, and this is a sad reality. Now, it is also true that our staff share the same daily life destiny than the rest of the population. One of the strengths of the organization is that our staff come from the community we are assisting and protecting. And this is one of the reasons why, despite the extraordinary dangerous environment, despite the fact that staff premises operation have been targeted, that we are still able to continue to provide life-saving assistance to the community.
And Israel seems determined to either sideline UNRWA or have it shut down altogether. If UNRWA didn't exist, if it simply stopped tomorrow, what kind of effect do you think that would have on the lives of Palestinians, not only in Gaza, but in other parts of the region as well?
It would be a total disaster. It would first mean the sacrifice of 1 million children below the age of 18 in the Gaza Strip, but denying them education in the future, and this would certainly sow the seeds for more resentment and extremism. But politically, that would also mean that if Israel get rid of an organization like ours in this region, that means any other country anywhere else in the world could do the same with a UN agency. And I believe this would open a Pandora box. It's very dangerous, and it would further weaken our common, I would say, multilateral instrument that we inherited after World War II.
Chris Gunness is a former spokesman for UNRWA. He told my colleague Marlene Saeed, what's happening in Gaza is a stain on humanity's conscience.
In the last year, we have seen Gaza transformed from what a former British Prime Minister described as the world's largest open-air prison. It then became the world's largest concentration camp. And today, Gaza has been transformed into an industrial-scale slaughterhouse. And I use the word slaughter advisedly because, frankly, animals in most abattoirs in the world are killed more humanely than the women and the children of Gaza. Shame on the Security Council, shame on those Israeli leaders who have done this. Shame, frankly, on all of us, because what we've seen in the last year is a stain on the conscience of humanity. It shames every one of us.
You once burst into tears on television when an UNRWA school in Gaza was hit and people were killed when they were sleeping on the floor of that UN classroom. Of course, over the course of the last year, we've seen this happen again and again and again. How does that make you feel?
Look, it's appalling, but it's really not about how I feel. I have shed many tears, and so have others around the world, frankly, for the deaths on both sides of this conflict. And the emotion of the moment must not get the better of us. What we need to see is a return to talking. I have little doubt, given what's happening in Lebanon, given that Israel has now attacked 6 other countries. We've seen attacks in Lebanon going in both directions, of course, Palestine, Gaza, and the West Bank. And let's not forget about what's happening in the West Bank, Syria, Iran, and Yemen. And I think at the end of the day, we all agree that the emotion has got to be put aside. The only thing that will get the hostage drama sorted, the only thing that will see the slaughterhouse end in Gaza, the ethnic cleansing that we're now seeing, the appalling attacks on civilian areas, not just in Beirut, but across Lebanon. The only way this is going to end is if there is a return to talks. And tough as it seems at this moment, with clear ethnic cleansing taking place in northern Gaza, people are being pushed out. And by the way, it's Gaza today, it'll be the West Bank tomorrow, because many Israeli politicians have said quite clearly that Judea and Samaria belongs to the Jews. Now, if we're going to see this madness end and Israel living in security, the Palestinians must be given their own state.
Chris, I want to just go back to UNRWA, the organisation, the importance of it. We saw the largest contributor to UNRWA this year, the United States, as well as other countries, halt their funding after Israel accused some of its staff of being involved in those October 7th attacks. That accusation was then eventually found to be untrue. What did you make of those accusations at the time, and why is it so critical that funding for UNRWA continues?
I'd love you to dig out the clip, because I said on this very program immediately that this was the mother of all lies. It simply wasn't the case that Israel had credible evidence against any members of UNRWA staff. And as your package before me quite rightly said, and the quote was precise, they were fired, the staff that UNRWA fired were fired because they may have been involved. Now, I don't know of any court in the world where a judge says you may have committed murder, therefore I'm sending you to prison. The Commissioner General of UNRWA says that he's done this in the interest of protecting the agency, and he did this under huge pressure because he had a massive responsibility to the 5.9 million refugees that UNRWA serves. But to be very clear, the attack on UNRWA is an attack on the peace process itself, and it's an attack on Palestinian self-determination, and it's an attack on a two-state solution. It's an attempt to say that the refugees can be airbrushed out of history. They simply don't exist as a factor in the peace process and in the future political dispensation of a Palestinian state of peace in the Middle East. Well, I'm here to tell you that you cannot airbrush out of history 6 million people. They are in here, they have inalienable rights. They are individuals, each with a destiny and an individuality and a dignity that must be respected. And the world has to realize that these Palestine refugees have had their dignity removed from them since 1948, those that were there in 1948 and their children, and under all accepted best practice in refugee law, the children of refugees, while there's an unresolved refugee problem, they themselves are refugees. So let's be clear, the Palestine refugees exist as a people. They have collective memories, they have collective experiences, and they have collective and individual rights.
Israel's war on Gaza has been the deadliest conflict in recent memory for journalists. Israeli attacks have killed 174 media workers in Gaza in the past year. The International Federation of Journalists says that mortality rate is more than 10%. Laura Khan has this report.
These vests serve to protect and clearly identify journalists, yet they've offered little protection for Palestinian journalists who risk their lives to report on Israel's relentless bombing of Gaza.
Back into Gaza. Do you know anything
on the first day of the war, October 7th, this happened. A bomb went off near Al Jazeera reporter Yumna Al-Sayed as she reported live in Gaza City, and the building behind her, home to several media institutions. It was a sign of things to come. Just 2 days later, this would become the final broadcast from journalist Saeed Al-Tawil.
للأسف تم تحذير برج حجي بالقصف.
The editor-in-chief of a news website, along with 2 other journalists, stood at a safe distance from a building Israel warned it would bomb. Instead, it struck a building nearby, killing all 3. While international media have only been allowed in with the Israeli army under heavy censorship, journalists in Gaza have been pivotal in documenting and exposing possible Israeli war crimes and the suffering of Palestinians. Among them is Al Jazeera's former Gaza bureau chief, Wael al-Dahdo, who continued in his pursuit to report on the war, even after his wife, teenage son, 7-year-old daughter and his grandson were killed in an airstrike. In mid-December, he and Al Jazeera cameraman Samer Abu Daqqa were caught in a strike while filming at a school. While Abu Daqqa was wounded and still under heavy fire, a network of human rights groups and journalists pressured Israel to let them rescue him. Arriving 6.5 hours later, it was too late. Abu Daqqa had bled to death. Dahdo was injured in the same strike. Less than a month later, Dahdo's oldest son, Hamza, travelled to southern Gaza to document the aftermath of an Israeli attack, but never returned. A direct strike on his vehicle killed him and his colleague, Mustafa Thoraya. Wael Dahdo paid tribute to his 27-year-old son. For much of the war, Al Jazeera correspondent Ismail Al-Ghul was reporting from northern Gaza. He and his cameraman Rami Al-Rafi were directly targeted in an Israeli strike on his car. Both were wearing press vests. These are just some of the stories of journalists who set out to tell the truth about Israel's war on Gaza. And these are the names of all the journalists killed while doing so. Those who died in the first few months of Israel's war on Gaza made up 75% of all journalists killed around the world in 2023. Last year, this reporter tore off his press vest after learning of his colleague's death, saying it offered no protection. And in Gaza, many people know that wearing a press vest can even make them a target. Yet, it's also come to symbolise the pursuit of truth in the face of death. Laura Khan, Al Jazeera.
Well, earlier my colleague Rob Matheson spoke to Tim Dawson, the Deputy General Secretary of the International Federation of Journalists. He says countries that commit war crimes against journalists must be held accountable.
It's beyond shocking. Watching that report really brings tears to my eyes, despite having followed this story very closely from the outset. The toll paid by journalists in Gaza is something really that humanity has no prior experience of. As your reporter said, well over 10% of all journalists in Gaza have lost their lives since this conflict began. The usual mortality rates expected of infantry soldiers is less than 5%. The number of US Marines who were killed in Vietnam was less than 5% of those deployed. So we're talking about absolutely shocking levels of loss of life. And really, perhaps even more remarkable than that tragedy is that so many journalists in Gaza have continued working, have continued despite the extraordinary privations they've suffered with little food, no shelter, no fuel, but they have continued to act as the eyes and ears of the world and brought out extraordinary and brilliant stories of the terrible destruction that's been wrought on their communities.
When we're live with our crews in Gaza in particular, we can often hear Israeli reconnaissance drones flying overhead. We heard it with Tariq al-Bawzoum when we were talking to him from Deir al-Balah just a few minutes ago. The Israeli military says it does not intentionally target or harm journalists. What's your reaction to that statement?
Well, we know that the Israeli Defense Force have some of the most sophisticated surveillance equipment in the world. They're able to track people from mobile phones with minute precision. We know that they have some of the most precise geolocating technology, allowing them to know where people, the patterns of movement, where they go at night, whom they associate with. And we know that they have highly sophisticated AI-enhanced targeting equipment that allows drones to deliver death to street addresses pretty much in the way that Amazon delivers books and compact discs. When you take all of that technology and the extraordinary death toll that has been visited upon journalists in Gaza, as well as the orchestrated and campaign against any kind of reporting from the enclave, it's very hard not to conclude that these are deliberate actions. And I think what's most important now is for the International Criminal Court to intensify its investigation and really get to the bottom, because I think, in war, accusations fly about and half-truths and much evidence is buried beneath piles and piles of blown-up concrete. What we need now is judicial examination of the evidence that there is and a holding to account, where that's necessary, of those who've perpetrated war crimes.
Philippe Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA, was telling us just a few moments ago as well that 226 UN workers are now known to have died. Of course, medical crews have been targeted in these conflicts as well. Do you think that the world has a different perception when it comes to the deaths of journalists as opposed to medical crews and aid workers?
All these deaths in Gaza, the vast bulk of which are women and children, whatever their occupations, are utterly, utterly tragic. Of course, those occupations that put themselves in the way of harm, as medical staff do, as relief staff do, as journalists do, perhaps it seems like a greater tragedy. When medical staff lose their lives, of course, it affects the ability to provide healthcare within Gaza, and that is vitally, vitally important at this point. Where journalists lose their lives, it stops channels of information from getting out of Gaza. We know that great efforts have been made to keep international journalists from the enclave. We know that lots of hurdles have been put in the way of free and fair reporting of what's happening in Gaza. So as well as the human tragedies of journalists losing their lives while simply trying to do their job, there is the tragedy for the rest of the world, that it's harder for us to understand what's happening there, that the truths that are happening on Gaza streets every day are being kept from the world. So one life is not greater or more important than another, but the impact on the rest of humanity and our ability to know is greater when journalists lose their lives.
A number of environmental activists have described Israel's devastating war on Gaza as ecocide. The term refers to the devastation and destruction of the environment to the detriment of life. It emerged during the Vietnam War, when the US government used a toxic herbicide, Agent Orange, to clear forests that provided Viet Cong fighters with cover and food. Well, the International Criminal Court can prosecute environmental crimes. It never has. Several nations have been pushing for Ecocide to have its own war crimes category. The Gaza government media office says Israel has dropped 85,000 tons of explosives. Military pollution and contamination of the soil, water and air will take years to clean up. More than half of the farmland in Gaza has been destroyed in Israeli attacks, and the Israeli military is reportedly pumping seawater into the underground network of tunnels used by Palestinian fighters. That could cause long-term damage to the Strip's only freshwater supply, underground aquifers, and make agricultural land barren for decades. Well, before the war, Gaza had a functioning agricultural sector despite the Israeli blockade. In 2022, its farmers exported produce worth more than $16 billion. But that all changed over the past year. Our environment editor, Nick Clark, has this report.
The harvests helped ease the grip of years of Israel's blockade. There were crops of strawberries and yields of sweet potatoes and aubergines. There were tomatoes grown in the greenhouses of Gaza, and groves of date and olive trees. And then now crops raised, orchards uprooted, greenhouses destroyed. What the bombs didn't wipe out, the bulldozers did. Agricultural land has been poisoned with heavy metals from munitions. Tanks have compacted soil, making areas impossible to farm.
This vegetable nursery was fully functional before the Israeli attacks. It's now completely destroyed by incendiary bombs. We lost all our tools and equipment and all the vegetable seedlings we had grown.
So satellite images analysed by Al Jazeera show that well over 60% of Gaza's farmland has been damaged or destroyed by the Israeli attacks. This is Beit Lahir in June 2023. It's an area famous for its strawberries, and as you can see, the fields are green and full of produce. But spin on 11 months and they're crisscrossed by vehicle tracks, devoid of any produce. This is Zaytun. Again, the fields are green, but 11 months on, all the greenery has vanished. The air is polluted with dust and asbestos from destroyed buildings. According to a preliminary investigation by the UN's Environment Programme, Israel has generated over 39 million tons of debris in Gaza, much of it contaminated with unexploded ordnance and other hazardous substances.
The military actions so far have nearly destroyed most of Gaza's environment as we know it. 2/3 of all agriculture areas have been destroyed by military operations, by tracked vehicles, by bombings, and over 45% of all greenhouses and over 50% of all agricultural wells have been destroyed. So that means like there's substantially damage to the environment where people in Gaza are depending on.
Rubbish collection has stopped, sewage has made its way into streets, tents, and the sea, poisoning ecosystems, making fish unsafe to eat at a time when the Strip faces famine. With fresh water contaminated and many wells destroyed, the Palestinians' ability to draw deep from an innate resilience is being eroded by a year of relentless Israeli assault. Nick Clark, Al Jazeera.
Kate McIntosh is the Executive Director of the UCLA Law Promise Institute Europe. She says that despite the push for ecocide to be made a crime under international law, there is already a possibility to prosecute it under existing laws.
There has been a proposal now to add the crime of ecocide to the statute of the International Criminal Court. That's just happened. It was proposed by a number of Pacific Island states, Vanuatu, Samoa and Fiji. But it doesn't currently exist in the statute. And I think the reasons for this are really the lack of appreciation of the interrelatedness between our environment and ourselves, which is no longer the case. I mean, as we proceed into destroying our environment in general, the understanding that wherever this crime occurs, it's a crime against all of us and therefore should be an international crime or crime against humanity, as you put it, is becoming more and more widespread. In fact, the environment is protected in conflict quite substantially. And the International Committee for the Red Cross, for example, has been doing work to try and raise awareness about this. But the current prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is paying attention to this and is actually working now on a policy to guide his prosecution of environmental crimes under the existing laws and the statute. So there is law there. There is law under which the kind of war crimes we've seen in Gaza against the environment can be prosecuted. And the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court is signalling that he is willing to start putting that into practice.
Well, every single aspect of life in Gaza is affected by Israel's war, and sport is no different. The latest figures from the Palestine Football Association show more than 400 athletes and sports officials have been killed. Of those, 313 were footballers, including 87 children. Israeli attacks have also destroyed more than 50 sports facilities in the Strip, including stadiums. David Stokes reports.
Khan Yunis Stadium is no longer used for football games. Severely damaged, it's now a makeshift refugee camp. A clear sign of the impact that Israel's war on Gaza has had on sport.
Israel has been systematically targeting sports across the territory, and around 50 sports facilities that have been reduced to rubble in Gaza. One stadium remains intact, which is Al-Dura Stadium in Deir al-Balah. And unfortunately, it has been turned into a shelter for thousands of displaced people. This war has been the deadliest and the most heartbreaking, the most demolishing for Palestinian sports in Gaza.
The majority of sporting infrastructure in Gaza has been destroyed, from large arenas to local gyms. These bodybuilders continue training among the debris. Others use this gym, which has been completely rebuilt outside, using equipment rescued from the rubble.
I lost everything. We lost our families, our homes. We also lost our future. We have no future, no life, nothing. We come here to the gym just to release the anger.
Weightlifter Mohamed Hamada lost out on a place at the Olympics. He injured himself carrying water for his family and lost 20 kilos in weight due to poor nutrition, at times eating animal feed to survive. 8 Palestinian athletes did make it to the Paris Games, most of them based abroad or in the occupied West Bank, where Israeli raids and checkpoints make it hard to practice. 800-metre runner Mohamed Douaida was forced to run on the roads of Jericho instead of a proper track.
Our participation is an achievement on its own. When they announced Palestine at the opening ceremony, the earth shook. I had a feeling that cannot be described.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's hard to comprehend how Palestine's next generation of Olympians can possibly emerge from this war. But sport continues to endure even in the toughest of environments. Whether it's boxing, arm wrestling or parkour, exercise and physical activity offers up a little joy and hope in the most desperate of times. David Stokes, Al Jazeera.
Well, despite the destruction in Gaza, Palestine's national football team have performed better than ever. In January, they reached the knockout stage of the Asian Cup for the first time, and they're now into the third round of qualifying for the World Cup, all without being able to play at home. Basil McDaddy is the founder of FootballPalestine.com.
the team has managed to create history, not just do well in spite of the circumstances, but do better than they ever have done before. They were put in a group in World Cup qualifying that included Australia, Lebanon, and Bangladesh. They finished in the top two. They're now in the final group stage of qualifying in Asia amongst the 18 best teams. To do that with no football going on in the country, with the emotional impact of players' families being stuck in under the bombs in Gaza is an incredible achievement. To get out of the group at the Asian Cup for the first time in their history is an incredible achievement. Last month, this group of players went to Seoul and got a point from South Korea. One of the most incredible stories of this entire qualifying period is the goalkeeper, Rami Hamadi, has been without a club since the war started. He has kept a clean sheet in 5 out of the 7 World Cup qualifiers he's played in, the latest one being that 0-0 draw against South Korea and so on. He still doesn't have a club. And I think that's very emblematic of this team's personality and their resilience, and the fact that there are players in this team that are in limbo career-wise, but for whatever reason they're able to come to national team camp, compete for their place, retain their place, and then compete at a very, very high level.
Well, Palestine have repeatedly urged football's governing body, FIFA, ban Israel because of its war on Gaza and other alleged rule violations. But FIFA has delayed making a decision 4 times this year, saying it needs more time to investigate. We spoke to sports law specialist Katerina Pietlovich, who has advised the Palestinian Football Association.
We have asked to suspend Israel from football because of inclusion of illegal settlement clubs in Israeli Football League. And those clubs also host Israeli Football League matches on the Palestinian territory. The FIFA has clear statutory rules which provide that in such a situation, all those clubs that are playing, that are in fact located on the territory of another association, cannot play for any other association. Just like Belgian clubs wouldn't be able to play in French Football League. When Russia joined Crimea clubs in its league, they were all promptly kicked out on the basis of equivalent rules. So we are just asking FIFA to apply their own regulations and statutes. Right now, we have also International Court of Justice confirmation that it amounts to annexation, in fact, and that there is an apartheid regime being implemented in West Bank. So if we historically recall how a country that was implementing apartheid regime before was treated, they were kicked out for decades, and that is South Africa. We have precedents of Russia, just recent one, 2.5 years ago, that was due to the invasion of Ukraine, kicked out from the entire international sport, including football. And we have now a country that is doing a lot worse, including stands accused of genocide, and the FIFA is doing nothing, and neither is IOC.
Well, for a year, our reporters in Gaza have been working around the clock, covering all the latest developments. The grueling work is vital to keeping the world informed about Israel's actions in Gaza, but it's come at a personal cost. We'll hear from our correspondent Hani Mahmoud in just a moment, but first, Ibrahim Al-Halili shares his experience.
I am Ibrahim Al-Khalili, a journalist from northern Gaza City. This is the place where I got detained by the Israeli forces during the last ground incursion of Al-Shifa Medical Complex and the surrounding area where I live. And this is the front door of our destroyed house. On the 18th of March, the Israeli forces stormed the area, and after 10 hours of heavy bombing, they forced us out in the morning in the freezing weather. It was not sunny like this, it was raining cats and dogs. They forced all the neighbors on their knees, and they put handcuffs on all the neighbors' hands. After 10 hours of torturing, it was during Ramadan. They took us to the vicinity of Al-Shifa Medical Complex. After a long investigation with us, they released me out with my father. But unfortunately, the sad story is that my brother got detained and his destiny remains unknown till this day. And this is the most terrifying day and most miserable day I have experienced during this genocidal year of the Israeli war on Gaza.
I don't really know where to start. It's been a whole year and I don't even recall when did I take this off, the vest that I'm wearing. There were nights where I had to sleep with it. Throughout the day I had to wear many hats, being a correspondent, taking care of Newsline. At the same time, between reports, the hat of a father before evacuating my family to safety. It was a huge issue for me. Salamat ya Yusuf, salamat ya Loai. Bye. My son was so fed up from staying at home and wanted to be with me, and I made a decision. It was quite risky, but I had just to offer him an alternative. So I took him with me to the site of my work where it happened. It just coincided with an attack.
As we were speaking to our correspondent in Gaza, an Israeli air raid targeted positions right behind him.
We're getting into Yes, sir. Oh my God, did you hear that? Oh my God, that's the hospital. Loai! Loai! تعال تعال بابا تعال تعال. Oh my God. No, this is really bad. This is bad. So that was the moment that I felt really worried and very concerned about the safety and the livelihood of my family. My only wish right now is just for this to end immediately, because we can't afford to have another year of this. So I start my day trying to be a little bit normal, just coming to my favorite spot here, an alternative to the coffee shop that I used to go in Gaza. This is really good. Now I feel like I'm gonna start my day properly caffeinated and I can be in vision and do my reports for at least the coming 4, 5, 6 hours, God knows, and unless something happens, which I really don't want to see. I don't want to see any breaking news. I don't want to see more people dying. I want to get to the point where I can report about a ceasefire and into this madness. This is what I want to see.
You're watching Al Jazeera. I'm Laura Kyle, and I'll be back with more news in just a moment.